In 1960, South Korea was poorer than Ghana. That is not a figure of speech. By the income measures of the day, a country with almost no oil, almost no arable land, and a capital city still rebuilding from a war sat below much of sub-Saharan Africa. American officials who studied it privately doubted it would ever pay its own way. 60 years later, that same country builds the ships, the memory chips, and the phones the rest of the world runs on. Samsung and SK Hynix between them supply a large share of the world's memory. Hyundai builds cars on 5 continents. Its people earn more than the citizens of Spain. One lifetime. A man born in that poor country could live to see his grandchildren grow up in one of the richest. Almost every explanation you have heard for this is a compliment. Koreans worked hard. Koreans valued education. Koreans sacrificed. All true, and all useless, because they describe 100 poor countries that stayed poor. Hard work is not a strategy. It is what people do everywhere. The question is, what turns hard work into a chip fab? Hey, welcome back to the Rise Index. If you're new here, this is where we follow the numbers behind who makes what, who profits, and how economic power really moves. Great to have you. Today, the machine that actually did it. 3 parts, working together, and the bill that came due when they stopped. By the end of this episode, we will put 3 figures on the Korean miracle: what it produced, what it cost, and what it can no longer do. Start with what it produced. In the early 1960s, GDP per capita was measured in the low hundreds of dollars. Today, in current terms, it sits above 30,000. Adjust it however you like. The ratio survives any honest adjustment. Now the second number, and it is the one that matters more. Korea did not just get richer, it changed what it sold. In 1965, its top exports were wigs, plywood and raw silk, human hair, cut boards. By 2023, its top exports were semiconductors, cars, ships, and refined petroleum. The same country, the same people. A completely different position in the world economy. That is the difference between growing and climbing. Plenty of poor countries grow. Very few change what they are able to make. And the distinction is not academic, so let us be concrete about it. A country that sells more wigs each year is growing. Its income rises with the wig price and falls when the wig price falls, and it is still, in every sense that matters, a wig country. A country that moves from wigs to plywood to textiles to ships to memory chips is doing something else entirely. Each step buys equipment, skills, and supplier relationships that make the next step possible. Climbing compounds. Growing does not. And here is the third number, the one that explains why this episode has a second half. Korea's fertility rate is now the lowest of any country on Earth. The machine that produced the climb is also producing that. Part 1. The state chose which industries to build, and it did not pretend otherwise. This is the part that makes economists uncomfortable, so let us be precise about it. Korea's government did not run the factories. It did something narrower and stranger. It decided which private companies would receive cheap capital, and it changed that decision based on results. Through the 1970s, the state pushed heavy and chemical industry, steel, shipbuilding, petrochemicals, later electronics. It had a name. The heavy and chemical industry drive launched under the Park Chung-hee government in 1973. Not because the market asked for it, the market emphatically did not. The famous example is steel. When Korea proposed building an integrated steel mill in the late 1960s, the World Bank study concluded it was not viable. A poor country with no iron ore and no coking coal had no business making steel. The mill was built anyway, at Pohang, part financed with reparations money from Japan. POSCO went on to become one of the largest and most efficient steelmakers in the world. And think about why steel specifically. Steel is not a product most people buy. It is what other industries are made of. Ships need plate. Cars need sheet. Construction needs beams. Appliances need coil. A country that imports its steel pays for it in foreign currency it does not have, and waits on a supplier who has other customers. A country that makes its own has the input for every heavy industry it might want next. So the steel mill was not really a steel decision. It was a decision about what Korea would be permitted to attempt in 20 years, and that is what the feasibility study, correctly assessing steel as a business, could not price. Now, the honest caveat, because this is where the story is usually abused. For every Pohang, there were industrial policies that wasted money spectacularly. The heavy industry push of the late 70s left behind excess capacity and a debt problem that took years to clear. Plants were built at scales the domestic market could not absorb, in sectors chosen partly for strategic reasons rather than commercial ones. By the end of the decade, the country was carrying serious inflation and a debt burden that forced a painful stabilization program. That episode is usually left out of the highlight reel, and leaving it out is how the story becomes propaganda. A government that picks industries will pick some wrong ones. The question is never whether it makes mistakes, it is whether it can stop paying for them. Picking winners is not a magic wand. It is a bet with public money. Korea's bets paid off often enough to matter, and the reason they paid off has almost nothing to do with the wisdom of the people choosing. It is the condition attached to the money. Part 2. The banks were an instrument, and the instrument had a condition. The state controlled the banking system and directed credit to the firms it had chosen. Loans came cheap and they came large. That much is common. Plenty of governments have handed money to favored companies. But this part was not common at all. The money kept flowing only if you exported. Think about what that condition does. A domestic subsidy can be captured. A company can take the money, build something mediocre, sell it to a protected home market, and keep the profits. Nobody outside is allowed to judge the product. An export target removes that shelter. To hit it, you have to sell to a foreigner who owes you nothing and has other options. That is the whole trick. Korea used foreign buyers as an examination board. Companies were not measured on their promises or their political connections. They were measured on whether a stranger in Ohio bought the thing. Economists call it export discipline. It is the least glamorous idea in development economics and probably the most important. The market could not be relied upon to allocate capital, but it could be relied upon to grade the results. So Korea let it grade. And when a firm failed the exam, credit was withdrawn. Not always cleanly, not always fairly, but often enough that it was believed. That belief was the discipline. Notice what the exam does to the inside of a company. If your funding depends on selling abroad, then the person in your organization who understands foreign customers becomes powerful. The engineer who can hit a foreign quality specification becomes powerful. If your funding depends on a ministry's goodwill, a different person becomes powerful. The one who is good at ministries. Both companies are receiving state support, but they are becoming different animals because they are optimizing for different judges. 10 years of that and one of them can build a ship. This is the part almost nobody copies. Dozens of countries have tried industrial policy. Most fund national champions and then protect them from consequence. The subsidy arrives, the exam never does. And you can see why, because the exam is politically miserable. It means telling a large employer in a real town with real workers and a real mayor that the money stops. It means letting something visible fail. Handing out capital is popular. Withdrawing it is not. Korea's genuine achievement was not that it chose well. It was that it could afford, politically, to stop paying for its own mistakes. Part 3. Korean families financed the human side of the machine out of their own pockets. An electronics industry does not run on capital alone. It needs engineers, technicians, quality inspectors, tens of thousands of them, trained faster than any public school system could manage. Korea got them. Literacy went from a minority of the population to near universal. University enrollment reached levels that embarrass much richer countries. The state built the schools. But the intensity, the tutoring, the cram schools, the years of a family's income poured into one child's exam result. That came from households, and it is still there today. Korean families spend a striking share of household income on private education. Hagwon, the after-school academies, are a full industry. In Seoul, some operate until near midnight, which is why the city had to regulate their closing hours at all. Here is the honest way to see it. Think of a factory that needs a skilled workforce and cannot afford to train one. Korea solved that problem by moving the cost off the company's balance sheet and onto the kitchen table. It worked. It produced one of the most educated workforces on earth, ready exactly when the electronics industry needed it. That is not an accident of culture. It is a transfer of cost from firms and state to families. And it was never voted on. And it kept working because of one specific mechanism. On exam morning, the country reorganizes itself around it. Businesses shift opening hours to clear the roads. Flights are held during the listening section so aircraft noise does not disturb candidates. Look at what that produces. If one test determines a career, then any family that can afford extra preparation will buy it. And once enough families buy it, the test measures preparation as much as ability, so the next family has to buy more. It is an arms race, with a compulsory entry fee, and the fee is paid by parents. So there is the machine. The state picks the industry. The banks fund it on condition of export. Families staff it and pay for the staffing themselves. 3 parts, locked together. Remove anyone and the other 2 stop working, which is exactly what is happening now. Every machine has an operating cost. Korea's is not hidden, and it is not a metaphor. It shows up in 3 places: hours, concentration, and children. Start with hours. For decades, Korea worked among the longest hours in the developed world. Near the top of the OECD table, year after year. The statutory maximum was cut to 52 hours a week in 2018. And notice what that number tells you about what came before it. A country does not legislate a 52-hour ceiling unless the ceiling is lower than the practice. Second, concentration. The chaebol. The family-controlled conglomerates are the visible output of the credit machine. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK. Fund a handful of firms for 30 years and you get a handful of enormous firms. Samsung Electronics alone accounts for a share of the Korean stock market's value that would be unthinkable for any single company in the United States or Germany. The country's export performance is concentrated in a small number of groups. That concentration is a strength when the chosen industries are winning. It is a national exposure when they are not. Korea's prosperity is unusually dependent on a small number of boardrooms making correct decisions about semiconductors. Third, and this is the one that will decide the next 50 years, Korea has the lowest fertility rate of any country in the world. Well below 1 child per woman, a level with no historical precedent in peacetime. Be careful here, because this is where commentary gets lazy. Nobody can prove a single cause. Falling birth rates track with wealth everywhere. But it is worth stating the arithmetic that a young Korean couple is actually looking at. Housing in Seoul is expensive. Private education for 1 child runs for years and is treated as non-optional. Working hours are long. Careers punish interruption, particularly for women. Every one of those pressures is a direct output of the machine that made the country rich. The education intensity that staffed the factories is the same intensity that now prices a second child out of reach. That is not a moral judgment, it is a design consequence, and it was invisible for 40 years because the bill arrives a generation after the benefit. So, the obvious question, if the machine worked, why does almost nobody else run it? Part of the answer is that the climate has changed. Korea industrialized through an era when a poor exporter could sell into rich markets with relatively little friction, and when copying and adapting foreign technology carried lighter legal consequences than it does today. Intellectual property enforcement is tighter now. Trade rules constrain the kind of directed subsidy Korea used freely. The bottom rungs of the ladder are simply further off the ground than they were in 1965. And there is a second constraint that has nothing to do with rules. The rungs themselves have thinned. As we saw 2 episodes ago, modern factories need fewer workers per dollar of output, which means the classic route, absorb millions of low-skilled workers into export manufacturing, absorbs fewer of them than it used to. That is worth sitting with, because it breaks the standard advice. For 60 years, the recommendation to a poor country was the same. Start with cheap labor in simple manufacturing, then move up. Textiles, then electronics assembly, then components, then design. The first rung on that ladder was low-wage, labor-hungry factory work. It was unglamorous and often harsh, and it employed enormous numbers of people who had nowhere else to go. Automate that rung, and the ladder does not disappear. But the bottom of it lifts off the ground, and the people who used to reach it are left standing underneath. Korea climbed a ladder, but is still there. It is just shorter at the bottom, steeper in the middle, and more crowded at the top. More crowded matters too. When Korea entered electronics, it was competing with a handful of Japanese and American firms. A country attempting the same move today competes with Korea itself, plus China, plus Taiwan, plus everyone else who already climbed. The rungs are not just higher, somebody is standing on each one. Which brings us to the part of the Korean story that is genuinely portable, and it is not the K-Bowl and not the 5-year plans. It is the exam. The insight that public money given to private firms must be tied to a test. The government cannot fake, and the firm cannot lobby its way around. Export performance was Korea's test. It need not be yours. But without one, industrial policy is just a transfer. And transfers do not build chip fabs. So we can answer with 3 figures, the way we promised. What it produced. A move from wigs and plywood to semiconductors and ships, and a GDP per capita that crossed from the bottom of the world's income table into the top quarter. Inside one working life. What it cost. The longest working hours in the rich world, an economy concentrated in a handful of family groups, and the lowest birth rate on the planet. And what it can no longer do. Run unchanged. The machine's 3 parts assumed a young, growing, willing workforce. 2 of those adjectives no longer apply. Here is the correction this episode exists to make. The Korean miracle was not a miracle, and calling it one is how the lesson gets lost. Miracles cannot be studied, machines can. The state chose. The banks enforced. The families paid. Each part is copyable in principle. And the reason the model has spread so poorly is that most countries copy the first part, occasionally the third, and almost never the second. Korea's real achievement was not choosing steel. It was being willing to stop funding a company that could not sell its steel to anyone. And there is a harder lesson underneath that, which is the reason this episode belongs beside the others in this season. Every part of the machine that made Korea rich, extracted something from rich, extracted something from someone. Extracted something from someone. The state extracted risk tolerance from taxpayers who funded bets that sometimes failed. The banks extracted discipline from firms, which meant real companies closing and real jobs ending. Families extracted savings, hours, and eventually childbearing years from themselves. It worked because a generation accepted those terms, many with no say in the matter, and because the payoff arrived fast enough that their children could see it. That is not a model you can simply choose. It is a bargain a society either makes or does not, and the part that decides is not economics at all. Whether that discipline survives contact with an aging population, an economy resting on a few boardrooms, and a generation deciding not to have children. That is the open question of the next 20 years, and it is genuinely open. Anyone who tells you the answer is guessing. Korea shows what it looks like when a poor country builds the machinery to become rich. But the map moves in both directions. There is a country that started the 20th century richer than most of Europe, with grain, cattle, railways, and one of the highest incomes on earth, and spent the next 100 years going the other way. Next time on The Rise Index, why Argentina went from rich to poor, and what it tells us about how prosperity is actually lost. This is The Rise Index. Subscribe and follow where power moves next.